Hello everybody, and welcome back to my card game tutorial series. In this video we're going to work on creating an infinite hand size, or a hand size that will allow us to hold as many cards as we would like. We're going to create an animation for the cards to be sent to the graveyard or discard pile. And we're also going to be working on layering the game so that the objects are printed in a specific order. So what I mean by that is, in our last video where we left it off, if I were to pick up this card, it gets drawn below the cards that have been drawn before it. If I set this card on the field and print the deck over it, the deck is printed behind that card and the prize cards. If you enjoy this series, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you would like to support this channel, consider becoming a patron, linked in the description below. So the first thing we want to do is remove all of the conditions that dictate our hand size. So in our macros object, we're going to remove the max hand macro, and in our draw script, we're going to remove the condition that says if our hand count is equal to the max hand, don't draw a card. Another thing we want to change is in our remove from hand script. What we need to change is this for loop. We need to change this 7 to equal the player hand count, because now there isn't a max hand, so we need to make sure that this will go through every single card in the player's hand. Another thing we want to change is in our object card. In the step event, we have our X position equivalent to this, but we only want it to have this X position if our hand count is less than or equal to 8. Now, as the hand grows, we want to change the spacing of the card. So if our hand count is greater than 8, we want our X position to change depending on how many cards we have in our hand. And this is the equation I came up with to do that. So what this equation is doing is centering our hand in the middle of the room using these values here, and then it's going to add this value so that the first card is printed entirely on the field, and then it's going to print the card to the right by this value multiplied by what position it is in the hand. So each card in the hand is going to be printed more to the right than the other by this value. That may not make sense, but I'm going to show you what that will look like in just a moment. Before I do that, I would like to correct a mistake I made in the last video. In the last video, I added this code and this code to change the depth of the card if it were to be selected. But this is not the selected condition. So let's move this to the draw event where it belongs. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. So let's see how this looks. One hurdle we are going to have to go over is we're able to select one of these cards. And we can only select the card if it is in its original X and Y position. So when we had 8 cards, that was never an issue because none of the cards overlapped each other. But if we begin to add cards, and if I try to add more than one card, we get an error. That's because the hand count variable does not belong in the object card, or the card object. So let's see how I made this mistake. As you can see right here, I did not put the player object designator before this variable call. So now that I have that, I should be able to draw as many cards as I want. So this is what we're used to seeing. So now if I draw one more card, we see that the cards shift a little bit. This card is staying in the same spot, but all of the subsequent cards are moving closer together. So, depending on how many cards I've drawn, the amount of card you can see begins to shrink. I can select this polywag card without there being a problem because there's no card being printed in the spot that I'm selecting. But now since these cards are being drawn on top of each other, if I try to select the Professor Oak Trainer card and the Polyrath Trainer card, you'll see that I'll select both of them. And in some cases, I'm not even able to select a particular card. And even though I'm selecting on this Squirtle, I'm selecting the card behind it. That's because when we set up this select function, we did not need to account for having cards being printed on top of each other. So we're going to need to figure out a new way to select a card so that it knows only to select the card that we are clicking on. So let's do that now. This is going to be in the same object. We need to remove the old way of selecting the card. So instead of using the left down event, we are going to create a new one, and it's going to be mouse left pressed. And in order to select the card, we're going to use this condition. So what's happening here is that we're going to create a new script that will determine what card we are selecting. And if that card we are selecting is equal to the hand position of the card, we are going to set that value to a temp variable, and then we're going to set only that card to be true. So now let's create this script. So in order to do this, we want the program to look at the last card in our hand, or the one all the way towards the right, and see if the cursor is within its boundaries. And if it's not, go backwards towards the first card, which is the card towards the left. So the script is going to look like this. So this for loop is going to check the mouse X position and compare it to that card's, the object card's X position. And if it is within the X boundaries, return the hand position. Now, we don't need to consider the Y position of the mouse because this is only going to happen if the mouse is already in the card object's sprite mask. So now that we have that, we've now created the new way to select a card. But before we test it, let's fix the layering of our objects. So what you want to do is create certain depths for certain objects. So the depth for our hand cards are going to be in the -100s. So if the card is not selected, its depth is going to be -100 minus its hand position. Now, if it is selected, we want it to be above all of the cards in our hand. So we're going to set that equal to -200. Now for our deck, if we are printing it out, we want its depth to be above our hand cards and above the cards on the field. So if our face up variable is asserted, we want the depth to be equal to -300. So it's above our hand cards and it's above the field. And if it's not, then we're going to set the depth equal to 0 because it doesn't need to be printed over anything. So now that we have that, let's test it. So if we've done this right, we should be able to have all of the cards in our hand and then be able to select one specific card. So I'm going to select this Poliwag. And as you can see, now that it's selected, it's not drawn behind any of these cards. And it's not drawn behind the deck or the prize cards. And it's the only card I have in my hand. If I drop it down here, if I had multiple ones, they would begin to separate and I would see it. So now if I set the card down and I print the deck and drag it over, we can see now that the deck no longer is drawn underneath our field cards or our prize cards. So now the next thing I want to do is create a visual to set cards to the discard pile. Instead of it just doing this, I would like the cards to move from their position to the discard pile. So in order to do that, we need to add some things. So in order to do that, I need to create some new variables in our player object. What I want to do is I want to create a discard X position. Now we know that position is equal to our deck X position. Now I also want to create a discard Y position, and I'm going to set that variable to equal to the deck Y position minus the card height, and then I'm going to subtract 10 pixels also. So now that we have these variables created, I'm going to create a new alarm in our card object. Now what this alarm is going to do is whenever the card reaches the graveyard, add it to the graveyard and then destroy the card object. So if the point distance, and we're going to choose the X and Y position of our card object, and then the next X and Y position we are going to use is the ones we just created, which is going to be the discard X position and the discard Y position. Now if that is equal to 0, which means the X and Y position of our card is equal to the X and Y position of our discard pile, we want to add this card to our discard pile. And then we want to destroy the card. And if it is not, we are going to extend this alarm by 1 frame. So that means that we can have any card at any position on the field, and no matter where it is or how long it needs to take, if it's taking too long, we can just increment the timer until it gets there. Now, the next thing we need to do is initiate this alarm. And this is going to happen whenever we need to remove this card from our hand. And the only time we do that is in our left released event, when we're removing it from our hand. So we're going to change this, since we have these 2 lines already in that alarm. We're going to remove them and replace them with, if alarm 2 is equal to -1, alarm 2 is equal to 10. Now this value doesn't really matter, since it's going to increment itself until it gets to its destination, but I just chose 10. Now the next thing we need to do is, in our step event, we need to add a condition to tell the card to move to the discard pile, because if we don't, it's never going to move. It'll just stay where it is and never be removed from our hand or set into our discard pile. So if its alarm 2 is greater than -1, which means we have called this alarm, if the distance between the 2 cards, or between the card and the discard pile, is greater than 10, we want to move the card towards the discard pile. And we want to do that by 10 frames. And if it is not greater than 10 pixels, we want to set the X position of our card to equal the discard X and Y position. And we're going to set the speed equal to 0. In this line of code, we set the speed equal to 10 pixels, which is why when we come here, we want to set it to 0. Now, when you use these functions in GameMaker, it's good practice to use the same value in both instances. So you see I have 10 pixels here, and then at a speed of 10 pixels. Now this else statement is good to have, because if the distance between the card object and the discard pile is not exactly 0, it won't work, and it'll continuously move the card back and forth and wait until it is. Now to combat that, we're going to force it by setting the X and Y position to equal the X and Y position of the discard pile. We also want to change this to an else if statement. So it's either going to be moving the card to the discard pile, or it's going to move it back to its appropriate position. So now that we have that, let's test it out. So if I use this Bill card, you can see Bill now moves to the discard pile, and that card object no longer exists. So now if I use Professor Oak moves to the discard pile, but the other cards don't follow it. So we need to change the script of that trainer card. to include this new alarm we created. And that will actually be in the player alarm 4. So let's go to our object. So let's go to our player object, go to alarm 4, and this is the code we need to change. So we're going to remove this just like we did earlier. We're going to remove the instance destroy because the hand card alarm 2 already has that, and same with this line of code. And we are going to add if alarm 2 is equal to -1, alarm 2 is equal to 10. So now this will make the cards in our hand go to the discard pile when we use the Professor Oak card. And we also want to change this value, temp3, to be our hand count. So let's leave that there and just change it in the trainer script. And it's already there. So we don't need to do that. No. What we need to do is change this to our hand count -1. Now I needed to do this because if I didn't, this would make me remove too many cards from my hand, so that whenever I draw cards, it's going to try to draw a card in a hand position that is lower than 0, and you can't use a negative value in an array. So now let's test this. So if I use Professor Oak, all of the cards are now going to the discard pile. And to truly test this and make sure it works, let's just add all of the cards in our hand and see if that will break the code. So as you can see, I'm only selecting the card I want. And when I set it to the center of the field, we can watch all of the cards go to the discard pile. Now, when doing things like this, it's good to test the extremes of what you're doing. So say using the card when it's the only card in your hand, or when you have all of the cards you possibly can have in your hand, just to make sure that the code doesn't break. Now, one thing I want to do is be able to view the cards in our discard pile, just so each player can have the liberty to look at each other's discarded cards. So we're going to do this similar to how we did it for our deck object, but we're actually going to refine it to make it a little bit better. So the first thing we want to do is go to our discard object, and we want to create two variables. We want to create the face up variable. We're going to set that equal to 0, and we're going to set selected equal to false. Another thing we want to do is go to our player object. In the create event, we want to create another discard X position, and we're going to call it discard X2, and we're going to set that equal to discard X. And now we are going to create a step event for our discard object, and we are going to create a condition to allow us to view this, just like we did with the deck object. So if we push the left key, it will change the face up variable to equal 1 to allow us to view the cards in our discard pile. And if the right button is pressed, it's going to set that variable equal to 0 and then set the new discard x2 variable we created back to its original state. Now, in our deck object, we are already using this left event. So we're going to remove that. Another thing we want to do is change our player deck x2 equal to player deck x, just like we did before, so that whenever we recall doing this, it goes back to its original state. So now if we go back to our discard object, so what we're going to do to move the card is if face up is asserted, we're going to make the depth equal to -300, just so it's drawn all over the field cards and our prize cards. And then with our player object, if the mouse Y position is within the discard Y position, and our mouse X is greater than the discard x2 variable minus our card width divided by 2. We want to move the view of our discard pile. Now, this is already a little bit different than what we did in our deck object. Now, I won't go into the differences between how I did the deck view and the discard view, and I'll just show you how it differs visually, and you can make the comparisons yourself. So, the next thing we want to do is if our mouse button is pressed, we want to set our object discard selected variable equal to true. And if that value is equal to true, we want to set the x view variable equal to our discard x2 position minus our mouse X position. And if our mouse button is maintained in the down position, we want to set our discard x2 value to equal the x view value plus mouse X. So our discard x2 variable is pretty much the view of our discard pile. Now, if the discard x2 value is greater than or equal to the discard x value, we're going to force the discard x2 value to equal the discard x value minus 1, so that it doesn't go past that point. And if the discard x2 value is less than this long value, we want to force it to stay in that position. So in short, what this is doing is if our deck or our discard pile is being fully stretched out and we've uncovered all of the cards, we don't want it to keep going off of the screen. We want to force it to snap back to where the last card that has been shown is drawn right on top of where the discard X value is. And I'll show that to you once we test this. And we want to create an else statement here to set our discard selected variable equal to false whenever our mouse cursor is not in that position. And if face up is not asserted, we want to change the depth to equal 0. Now, it appears that I have an issue here because I need to put a parenthesis there instead of an underscore, and that fixes that. Now, the next thing we want to do is change our draw event. So what we're going to do in the draw event is exactly what we did in our deck object draw event. So what I'm going to do is copy this over. And instead of it being an else statement here, I'm going to say if the object discard selected value or face up value is asserted, we're going to draw it like this. And then if it is not, we are going to draw it like this. And what we need to do in here is change every instance of deck to discard. And then I want to go back and change every instance of discard buffer to deck buffer. Now, if we did that correctly, we should now be able to view our discard pile. And we didn't do it correctly. And that's because discard X, we spelt discard incorrectly. So actually, let's copy that over because I don't think I can misspell that bad again. Where is this? Discard. In the create event. So that's actually in our player object, and I misspelled discard. Now, let's try this one more time. So I'm going to use the Professor Oak card to bring all of the cards to the discard pile. And then I'm going to press the left arrow key to print it. Now this kind of stuff happens when you copy and paste things over. So that's going to be in our draw event of the discard pile. And what the problem is we set our Y value to be set to Y view, which is equal to the deck Y value, and we need to set this to actually be the discard Y value. So let's try that one more time. So now I'm going to press the left arrow button, and it's not working. And I realized another issue is that we shouldn't be drawing the back of the card sprite, and we should be, so let's just change that. And now it's not allowing us to select the card. So let's see why that is the case. And that's because I messed up here. This should be another if statement if the mouse is pressed. And now we want to dent this all out. So what happened is I did not add this if statement. And this if statement is what initiates moving the discard view. So now that I've corrected that, the game should work properly. So I'm going to set Professor Oak to the discard pile. I'm going to press the left arrow key, and I'm going to drag this card out. And now we can see all of the cards. Now, this is done better than how we did the deck view. So this will only allow me to view this will only allow me to move the discard cards if my mouse cursor is within the boundary of the discarded cards. So if I were to try to do this outside of them, like next to this Polyrath, I can't move this. But if I were to do that with the deck view, I can move that as such, which isn't very desirable. Now, another thing that we made better is if I have a card in my hand and I drag it, it moves the deck view, but it doesn't move the discard view. We've essentially done the same code, but made it much better. Let's see if the cards are being set in the right position. So what should be the case is Professor Oak should be at the bottom, followed by Poliwag, Bill, Pokemon Trader, and this energy card. So we have Professor Oak, the Pokemon, Bill, Pokemon Trader, and the energy card. So Professor Oak was added first, then Poliwag, then Bill, then the Pokemon Trader, then the energy card. So that has been done correctly. Now, this is where I wanted to stop for this video. In the next video, we're going to begin working on a player clone. Now, I don't know if this is what it's properly called, but this is what I use when I'm playing a multiplayer game. What you want to do is you want to clone the other player's field because they aren't technically there. So what we're going to do is if I set a card down, I'm going to create script to also print it on the other field. Now, when we actually get to it, it's not going to go this way, but this will be used to show you the theory and the logic behind creating a player clone or an opponent clone. So if you're interested in seeing that, be sure to hit the subscribe button. If you have any questions on how to do this, or if you need any clarification, leave a comment in the description below. If you like this series and you want to see more of it, don't forget to hit the like button. Also, if you want to support this, be able to download these program files and get additional help when programming your own game or this game or whatever you need, be sure to become a patron. My Patreon is linked in the description below. And until next time.